I'm Sarah Knight, and welcome to It's Got Pockets, where just like finding the surprise pockets in your favourite trousers, I'm bringing you perfect pockets of joy and realness. Every week, I'm having unfiltered conversations with women who crack the feck on, even when life gets proper lifey. Women with experience, expertise and wisdom. Because sometimes the best stories start in the middle. Women who've been there, done that, and they're still figuring it out. Join me for real talk, useful tactics, and all the swears in between that make your life and business feel that bit more manageable. Hello. Welcome to another episode of It's Got Pockets. Today I am very excited because I have the lovely Alison Humphries with me. And Alison is joining us today to really get into the nitty-gritty of what it's like to be a woman in business, what it's like to be a woman running a business, managing a business and managing the juggle. Alison has got 30 years expertise and wisdom to share with us on running a business, leading a successful business with 100 million turnover to sale, which I want to get into the questions about how we manage negotiations like that. Is it different as a woman than a man? Do we see a difference in it? But also, really importantly, she's 38 years married. I mean, I'm on my second husband, so intrigued in how you've managed that one. 2 grandsons, 4 kids, an adopted northerner. And we were talking just before about being a frustrated lawyer, so I'm quite intrigued to get into it. Alison, welcome to It's Got Pockets.
Hi, Sarah. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Fantastic. So let's get started. So the first question I would like to ask you is, there's a whole heap of expertise and wisdom there. There's a whole heap of knowledge and investment in running a business, growing a business. How did you manage that with 4 kids?
I think in some ways I was quite lucky in that I was already being quite well rewarded when I had my first, which I was 25 when I had my first. So in today's terms, that's pretty young. Actually, it was in those days as well, in sort of graduate circles. But I was able to afford a nanny. And so it was somebody who came around my house, but she didn't live with us. And that was a huge relief in continuing to go out and work away all the time. I would be, overnight away for my then employer, which was Hayes. But I knew that there was a consistent loving figure there in looking after my child and later children. What were in the, I think, 12 years that I employed nannies. One of them was with me for 7 years and one best part of 4. And the rest were just very, very short term. So in that respect, it gave them a stability at home. But I have to say, I would be shattered coming home at the end of a working week. And I put in a huge amount of effort in the evenings and weekends with them. So this wasn't a complete outsourcing of my children in any way. My husband also was around in the evenings, and he was a very hands-on dad too.
Yeah.
So they've all turned out, I like to think, quite well. They may have a different view on things, but they're all very successful. And then I had the lovely event of becoming a granny in 2023. So I've got 2 little grandsons.
Fantastic. And did you have mum guilt? If you were going away and coming back, did you struggle with mum guilt?
Yeah, I did. And, look, I think there's got to be something biological there, isn't there? There were some real pressing things that I had to deal with. So number one, my husband's a barrister. Nowadays, you actually get paid while you're in pupillage as a barrister. In those days, you got paid nothing. And it then took a long time to build up a regular income. So, you might be earning money at the beginning of your tenancy, but it takes a long time to get paid it when you're just a junior. And so one of us had to be earning money, and I had a good salary and was advancing quite fast in my career. And so I did have that sort of mum guilt. And there was certainly, so I should point out that I had my 4 children. The total mat leave altogether that I took was 13 months.
Wow.
So 6 months was the legal minimum in those days. But the whole burden of proof was different in the law. In that if you felt you'd been discriminated against, the burden of proof was on the claimant. So it was almost impossible to successfully bring a claim, and people didn't. And I was told very clearly by the person I reported to at the time that I wouldn't want to be taking 6 months off, would I? Because that would be very career damaging thing to do. So as I say, I took very limited mat leave and always made sure that I was, back into it seriously and not in a kind of, oh, but I can't travel with work anymore way. So there was no compromise at all. This was at the time of, basically women can be successful as long as they act like men, rather than a changing the system time. So yeah, it was utterly exhausting because I do find that people like my parents' generation would still be expecting me to do everything at home as well, and would judge me by that rather than, by the standards that they would judge a man with a full-time working.
Yeah. I like to think that this is changing, but I see there's still so many conversations to be had about it. But I love what you said there. Well, I didn't love what you said there, but I thought it was very intuitive from that. Women can be successful as long as they act like men. And that's the era that I remember growing up in business in as well. And that we can have it all. We can absolutely have it all. It was sprinkling there. It was in front of us. You can have the job, you can have the career, you can have the children, you can do it all. But actually, that meant doing it all and doing it all at the same time. And when you say there's no compromise, there was no compromise. It was get up early, do your job, come home, do the mum, do the. And I wonder if it's changing. I wonder if there's a difference now.
I think so. Although clearly I'm no longer experiencing it firsthand. But when I look at my children who've had children, there is I'm not saying every employer would be like this, but their employers have been very flexible and clearly value them. And I think clearly have come to the understanding that it's not the women's fault that the men can't have babies. Yeah. And so I don't know who it was, but they definitely described the era I, had young children and a career as the fix the women kind of thing. In other words, make them more like men. Kind of period, whereas now it's a transform the system attitude. Yeah. And I thought, that puts it very well. There is I think, a school of thinking that says now, well, hang on, the problem here is systemic. The problem is not that women just aren't up to scratch, because we clearly are. And you can see that working all through the education system now, can't you? So, and the other thing that I think will be quite hard for people doing this nowadays to really grasp is just how much you had to basically ignore the fact that you were female at all. So it was literally, I made a decision, learned not to even mention my children in the workplace, because people would have that in those days jumped on it as a kind of, listen to her, she's on the mummy track kind of thing. And also, Sarah, if I'm really honest, and we're talking about the 1980s here, it would have been career suicide for me as I reached very senior positions. I was always both the youngest and the only woman in the room. And it would then have been career suicide for me to start being noisy about women's issues, because that's, and I did see it happen to one other person who, having achieved a similar level, decided that they wanted to leave the ladders down, as it were, and help other people in policy terms. And in those days, what you got was a rolling of eyes, and effectively that person became sidelined. So I learned from what was around me. I'm afraid I'm very much, well, like us all, conditioned by the times I grew up in. I'm afraid. So I wouldn't say I pulled up any ladders behind me. There just weren't any ladders. And if I had, tried to create ladders at that time, then it would have been very damaging to me. Later on, of course, completely different story. And I like to think that I've created opportunities for lots of women and made them heard and visible as well.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about the generation that we are now, is that understanding that we grew up where if you were noisy, it was self-limiting in your career and in your ambition, in the way you wanted to go. And actually the difference is now that it's not self-limiting, because actually by having a relevant voice, and you know, that it's really important to have a relevant voice. Having a relevant voice means that you're more likely to be heard and more likely to be able to create a system change. Whereas the system, it wasn't just that the system was against you and it was you were pushing water uphill. It was like the gates were locked, they bricked up the walls, and it was do it this way or get out, you know. And I think that one of the things that I've seen change, certainly in leadership as well, is that ability to talk about your kids. You know, I've always talked about my kids, and I think that that's not done me any favors. You know, I was a single mum for an awful long time in business, and I remember working in a huge advertising agency, and and it was me that had to leave and pick the kids up. It was me that had to, you know, and they were in all the after school clubs and, you know, latchkey kids going, but equally, if you had that phone call, it was me that was hightailing out the door. And I think that's the challenge as well about being a mum in business, is that I wanted to be the one out the door. You know, I wanted to be the one that was picking my kids up. You know, I made compromises and missed sports days, and you know, because there's only so many sack races you want to see, or how can you balance a beanbag on your head, frankly. But equally, it's that I love the fact that there is a movement towards transforming the system and how we move towards that. And then when you set up your own business, and you mentioned there about how you've moved forward to helping women in business, I'd love to know a little bit more about that. So talk to me, when did you set your business up?
So my own business, I originally set up in about 2005, I think, but it was under a different trading name. It was a bit of a story here. There was it was fashionable around that time for companies to kind of redefine their purpose, and some of them adopted these Latin style names. So you might remember this was when the post office renamed itself Consignia.
Oh my God, I've forgotten about that.
It's expense. And the whole idea was that we don't just do, you know, letters and post, and we're all sorts of exciting new things. And of course, nobody understood what consignia meant. Well, Stupid here did something similar, and I decided to call my business originally Amelius Consulting, from the Latin amelior, to improve, to make better. Yeah.
Love it.
Oh, that's very clever. Everyone will ask me about that if they didn't take Latin at school. And actually, do you know what turned out? Not only was it was terrible with search engine optimization, but on top of that, what they thought is that my name was Amelia, and it was a little sort of mom and pop. Oh, Amelia's.
Oh, hello, Amelia.
Now, I changed the name to Recruitment Leadership, which I'm very glad the URL was still available, because that kind of does what it says on the tin. And so there was a couple of hiatuses while I went and joined clients that I was working with as non-exec directors full time. But essentially, that business has been in place ever since. Can I just circle back, Sarah, to something you said earlier? When we were talking about, you know, the condition of women and so forth, I think it needs to be said that because of voices being more assertive, and numbers of women in the workplace has grown substantially, as a result of that, of course, women's rights are far better protected. And indeed, you know, there's numerous types of leave and everything that women and men can claim if they're parents or carers as well. So loads of legislation. But the biggest shift, which came about, I believe, in the very late 80s, early 90s, was when they switched the burden of proof. Up until then, we had the Equal Pay Act. And this was made conclusive when the Equality Act came in 2010, which basically said the burden of proof is, in effect, if there is what we call a prima facie case, on the face of it, the evidence, it looks like you've been discriminated against, the burden is now on the employer to prove that they didn't discriminate. And that really changed employers' behaviour. You know, they were actually...
So just because I struggle with though, before, the burden of proof was always on the individual to prove it. Right, okay.
And you can imagine that was nigh on impossible. If you thought, for example, that you'd been discriminated against on pay, compared to other people doing the same job. They were under no obligation to release the pay details to you. So yeah,
Wow.
it was a terrible, terrible this tokenistic system, which is why during all those years and until the Equality Act, really almost no progress was made with equal treatment. But the flip side of that is that as a small business owner and a director of some larger businesses, I do think that sometimes people who are employed need to bear in mind that they are employed by, in particular in small businesses, that they need to think about how this can work as well. So at the moment, lots of the people I work with, as in owners, directors of recruitment businesses, are getting requests, demands even, for a change to people's working hours or pattern. And obviously, increasingly, it's expected that they will have the right to demand flexible working from day one very soon. And I think there are lots of jobs where actually it could be considered. But I do think that people need to realize that in small business, it is very difficult to accommodate massive shortening of hours, so on, because, there are budgets that people need to aim for. And if we are saying everyone can work shortened hours, everyone can work shortened hours and everyone can work remotely and so on, then what you end up with, interestingly, is something a bit like the crisis we have in primary care now, where all the full-time GPs are only about 25%, so check that figure, of GPs are full-time anymore. And
gosh, I didn't realise that was the case.
It's a huge, huge balance. And they will say, well, it's because working full-time is just too much. It always has been. But they go part-time and, consequently, we've just got a very reduced number of appointments in the NHS system. And that's at a sort of national level. In a small business, one's legitimate request to, say, move to 4 days a week, because the cost of childcare is huge, can actually mean that somebody else has to pick up your work because you're working in a customer-orientated environment, aren't you? Someone else has to pick up your work on that day, and that affects their work and their productivity and so on. So I think we need to be realistic about this as well.
It's really challenging, isn't it? Because we, growing up in business, that system change, that policy change, absolutely then flipped the way that we could use our voices. Because therefore you can be heard, but you can be heard and something can happen rather than me just shouting in the middle of an office, this isn't fair. But equally, it's how far you go the other way, because, we all want an environment. One of the things that I think has been a blessing in COVID is that understanding that you can work brilliantly from home. And I think that's been a step change for so many women and men in business, in that actually that concentration at home mixed with the collaboration in the office is amber nectar when it comes to how we guide ourselves forward, how we build businesses with innovation and creativity. However, it's also that flex then that's needed, and how you understand it. Because like you say, in a small business, if you've got someone coming in, that can acutely affect your forecasts, how you run the business, how you maintain the business, and where the pressures come from as well, which then impacts mental health and well-being.
Yeah. It's a complicated mix. And then you throw in the extra demographic now, which is, I was technically, and I don't feel like it, at the very, very, very tail end of baby boomers, although I feel much more like a millennial in terms of the descriptions and characteristics and pensions. But then you have this oversupply of labour. And consequently, the balance of power was all with employers in those days. And, you have to remember that the time I was at uni was during all the miners' strikes and so forth. So there was some tough economic conditions going on at the time, and therefore labour was easily disposable and replaceable. Of course, what we've seen now, and in particular since the pandemic, is a much tighter labour market supply, and therefore, again, the balance of power shifts, doesn't it? But it won't go on like that forever. And we're actually in a change phase at this very moment, early 2025, when suddenly the availability of labour has really stepped up in all sorts of jobs. And therefore we see that balance of power. And do you know what? I was reading the paper at the weekend about what's going on in the US, and I was thinking it's interesting in how many articles and comment I'm now reading about the ED&I industry
Yeah.
in the UK that have come as a direct result of the Trump administration's approach to ED&I in the public sector. And I wonder how much we're going to be whistling that tune in the future.
Your mind is amazing with how you're retaining all this information, and I'm in awe. How do you
I'm not sure I retain it there. I open my mouth and it comes out.
Well, I'm loving it. I'm literally going, how do you know that? How have you retained that fact? But how do you consume your news? Because I think that's a really important, conversation that we all need to have, is that I know I step back from a lot of the news because it fries my brain with some of the hideousness that's going on. But equally, when I'm talking to my kids about it, my kids are technically adults. I use the word technically very loosely. How people are consuming news these days is very different, and understanding, I've got quite a short attention span, but understanding what's happening in this climate and how things are shifting is important of how we approach our working lives and how we approach what we want to do and how we move forward and how we create ambition and motivation for ourselves as well. How do you do it? Are you still newspaper led?
Do you know what? I am. And print media as well.
Yes.
So I have a newspaper subscription, which I love. And do you know one of the reasons? I could go and read the Times online, and that's part of the subscription. But one of the reasons that I love having paper, I don't love getting my hands dirty, but I do love the fact that article on anything, I love reading anything. And whereas if you go and use the online version, you get taken down a funnel of interests, articles suggested to you that are just more or same. And it's the serendipity, isn't it, of turning a page and thinking, what is that? But also, in old-fashioned media, the headline usually is, if you like, it's an invitation to read the article and find out more. I find, sweeping generalization, trigger notice here, I do find that a lot of people who rely entirely on social media for their news regard the headline as the news. So they never look into the detail and the caveats and so on. And of course, social media news is not held to the same standards as the traditional print media. So, gosh, we are having a wide-ranging conversation.
I know. Well, there's about 4 things I need to come back. But I grew up in the world of PR, and one of the things that we had to do in PR when as you were growing up in the world of PR was you had to go out, get every single newspaper, and your job every single morning was to go through every single newspaper, regardless of where your political alliances lay. It was everything you learned then about how you crafted a story, but B, importantly, news that you wanted to take back to the clients. And what I loved about what you said there, which I hadn't really thought about, is that the joy of going out and buying different media, regardless of where you support, because I know that's become a bloody political discussion in itself, but it is that you see things that you wouldn't normally see. Whereas with living and breathing online, we're absolutely being driven by an algorithm, which is supplying us. And that invitation to find out more versus clickbait is maybe where we need to push the conversation, because that's then how we learn a variety of things. That's how we see different perspectives. That's how we see the world through a different lens, rather than just seeing the world through the same lens all the time.
Yeah, just an interesting example of that. So if you look at equality law in the workplace, it's a complex thing. There are about 8 different claims you can bring under equality law, and 9, now about to become 10, protected characteristics that are protected under that act. Now, what you see very often in social media is what looks ridiculous. So £40,000 of damages awarded because boss didn't say hello. And people roll their eyes and think, oh my God, it's wokeness gone mad. Whereas actually, if you look into the detail and read the judgment, the award was not for that. That was part of the claim, but that wasn't what the award was for. And it wasn't for discrimination, sex discrimination. It was for something very specific. And similarly, you see ones like a teacher, I think in the West Midlands, who wanted to wear a face veil. And she was in a primary school and the head said it wasn't appropriate. And that teacher was awarded some damages, but it wasn't for the discrimination because that was considered reasonable. It was because she was victimized because she'd made a claim. In other words, she was treated less favorably because of the claim. And that was what it was for. So I think it is important to delve behind these headlines because what we've got is a situation where just reading these little snippets makes everybody think, oh, wokeness culture has gone mad. And also makes everybody really angry and paranoid. And I think if you look at most judgments, they're a lot more reasonable than people might realise.
Yeah, and that's just a note for us all. There's always a bigger story. There's always a bigger picture. Now, everything that you've been talking to me about different laws, equality acts, discrimination acts, and you run a recruitment business. I'm hearing frustrated lawyer, Alison.
I think I am a little bit frustrated. My original plan was I did my English degree at Oxford, and that was pure pleasure. I absolutely loved it. And then I was going to convert and do, a law conversion course and be a solicitor. But unfortunately, my husband was already on the path to being a barrister, and one of us needed to earn some money. So I went into recruitment. And I've got to tell you, quite rapidly, I was earning about 4 times what my colleagues of, former mates from uni were earning as trainee solicitors.
Wow.
So that was quite nice. And at a very early stage in my career, I could totally not control, but have huge influence over how much I earned, whereas they were in this system that wouldn't allow them to progress through it. The professions and so forth, they're very about time served, ticking the boxes, and of course, passing the exams. So it's funny how you find your way back to things like that, though, isn't it? Because I ended up being the chief examiner in employment law for the Recruitment and Employment Confederation, which is our trade body, for 30 years. And so I always maintain an interest in that. I used to set some fiendish questions, and anyone who's taken that qualification will know. So, yeah, please don't come after me.
Love it. As that was such a huge interest and part of your sort of DNA of how you're moving forward, when you were working and setting up your business, were you really conscious of the structure and the and I'm using law in a very broad term, the law behind the business?
Well, not so much for my business because I knew what my legal obligations were and I remain a one-person business. But for my clients, now, my clients are entrepreneurs who all of them want to grow profitably and would like to think that there's going to be a successful financial event, at some point in their working lives. And, some of them are at the beginning of that journey and some of them are actually very close to it. And a few years back, one business that I was a non-exec for said to me, look, we are really serious about the sale. I could see it was a good, well-run business, but they asked me to come on board full-time as MD for a range of reasons and bring the experience that I had, which was much wider than theirs. And I was very lucky. I was able to grow that business dramatically in 2.5 years through various means to a successful exit. But looping back round with the clients, the smaller clients that I work with in recruitment leadership now, I am absolutely clear to myself that if they're not already compliant, they need to want to be compliant if I'm going to work with them, because it is hard. I've got to say, all industries look simple from the outside, don't they?
Yep.
And I think people are often quite surprised how regulated the UK recruitment industry is. And pretty much everybody I meet wants to run a compliant business, but it's not always made easy for them. And there are wide differences between, if you're recruiting in, I don't know, offshore wind farms or recruiting accountants into businesses in the Northwest. There are different levels of compliance. So I just think that you've got to look at that in those requirements instead of as a burden. You've got to look at them as a business development opportunity, and being strong in that area, provably strong, allows you to take your proposition with confidence to lots of new customers, if I've explained that correctly.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things there. The first thing is, and what this is something I hear a lot, and I do hear it more from women than men,
Okay.
is that when we're talking about our careers and what's happened and how we've ended up where we are, I hear the word luck used an awful lot.
Yeah.
And, you know, and you just said then, you said I was very lucky too. And I would just love your perspective on that, because for me, that wasn't luck. That was drive, ambition, motivation. And, you know, yes, of course, sometimes, you know, lots of my career is, I love what Helen Tupper talks about, squiggly careers, you know, a lot of my career has been turning left instead of turning right. And then this has happened, but you make it.
Okay, that is such an important point. Do you know, even when I was using that word just now, I was thinking, I've said that quite a few times already. So listen, I'm a creature of conditioning, and you're absolutely right to call it, because I think partly I, like many women, feel embarrassed to just claim success, because that's not consistent with the behaviours that people at least used to expect of women. We were supposed to be modest, yeah, and you know, whereas the same behaviour might be perceived differently in a man. Second, I think there is always an element of the right opportunity coming along at the right time. When you see extraordinary growth, I'll give you an example. During the time, by the time I was in charge at this business, we moved from having 800 contractors out to 1,800.
Wow.
And I set up 2 other businesses as new divisions, and they were extraordinarily successful. But because I'd done something similar, it was a statement of works offering, and I'd done something similar at several businesses before. But an opportunity came along, funnily enough, through new legislation governing social workers and assessments and so forth. So you might say, well, you've spotted the opportunity, but it happened to come at the right time as well. So I think there's that, isn't there? Do you agree?
Yes, I absolutely think it's conditioned. I say it all the time, and I'm sense checking myself with it now, because I think what we're doing by doing that is we're giving our credibility to somewhere else.
Yeah.
And what we're doing is we're saying, yes, opportunity is huge. You know, when you look at, you know, when we look at privilege, you know, that's an opportunity. When we look at, you know, how we're able to be brought up, whether we can, you know, that privilege is an opportunity for us to then be innovative or to take chances and things like that. But the luck only happens if that opportunity is taken. And I think that's where entrepreneurship steps in as well. You know, you've got to have that mindset of going, I'm going to calculate that risk and I'm going to take it.
Yeah.
That's not luck. That's stepping a little bit into the unknown.
Yes, it is. And there are times in many women's lives where they can't take that opportunity.
Yeah.
So if I look at my world of recruitment agencies, the vast majority of them are led by men. And the time when they are starting those businesses, quite often their female counterparts are getting involved, you know, in growing a family. And of course, these men are involved in families too, but not in the same way exactly. So being able to take that risk or not is something that is disappointing. It's something that's been in effect denied to women because, oh, hang on, but I need a paid mat leave and I won't get one if I set up my own business, this kind of thing. Yeah. And I think that is a shame. But look, men can't have babies, right? So the flip side of that is that I would say, I hear people doing this calculation all the time. They tell me how expensive childcare is, and they subtract the cost of childcare from the woman's salary. Don't you agree? That is a false calculation.
Yeah. It's your, if you're in a joint income household, it's the responsibility of everybody.
It is. And I'm not just talking about ethically, though. I'm also talking economically, because if you do that sum, a lot of women will just say, well, for the margin that's left, it's not worth it. I'd rather be home with my kids. Here's the thing. Take 5 years out and the impact on your earnings, and for not just then, but for the rest of your life, statistically, is really significant. And even when you get to pensionable years, you are going to be on a very much lower pension. And so I think it's a false economy to say, oh, well, it didn't cover my salary didn't do enough extra from the childcare costs, because actually you've got a lifetime of career to think about. And, my children are all in their 30s now. I'm not pensionable age yet. So whatever you were thinking. So you've got to think beyond the early years stage, haven't you?
Yeah.
And
I think
you've
that's
had the
quite
extra
hard.
pressure of being a single parent as well.
Yeah. And I set my business up when I was pregnant because I'd been made redundant.
Right.
Well, the company I was working for had gone into administration. And so mat leave was something that didn't happen to me. I was very lucky because my mum was absolutely amazing when it came from a support point of view. And I think that that's what we do as humans, is that when we're in the moment, and certainly as, you're going into, if you're making those decisions and you're able to make those decisions about when you have children, if you can have children, all that sort of stuff. When you go into that, if you start to look at the cost, it's always going to negate the need, I guess. And I think that what we need to do is view it differently. As you said, if you've got two incomes coming into the house means that that's a responsibility you're going to take. But also that sense checking with yourself of, yeah, you might not know where you want to be in 20 years. But I also know at the age of 52 that this is where my career is flourishing. This is where I'm really enjoying it, and actually, I don't think I could have expected 26-year-old self to go, oh, imagine what you're going to feel like when you're 52, because at the time I was thinking that was well old. But at the same time, it's like, don't forget your future you. Don't forget the future you and what your future you is going to want, because the now you is going to be very different to the future you. And don't close off the opportunities. So just like I've said to my kids, whatever you do, that's fine, as long as you're not a traffic warden. But give yourself the choice. Give yourself the choice, whether it's through an exam, whether it's through an experience, whether it's through a contact, whether it's through a connection. Give yourself the choice of what you do next. And I think that's the thing. If you're looking at going into running a business, owning a business, starting a business, make sure you're leaving yourself with choice. And that choice, part of that choice is, if you're working within an organisation, don't cut yourself off from the choice because the maternity benefits don't look brilliant against your salary.
Yeah, very, very true. Yeah, I completely sign up to everything you just said.
So when you're looking back now and you've got 30 years expertise of not just running your own business, but helping run, navigate, build, grow, scale other people's businesses as well. Is there anything you'd do differently? If you were starting a business today compared to starting a business when you started a business, what would you do differently?
I would definitely have a marketing strategy from the beginning. So when I started, I was quite reliant on, I was entirely reliant on referrals and recommendations. And that's great. But remember, there's only so much work you can deliver with those people. And you can't keep tapping up the same people all the time for more referrals and recommendations, not for all time. So I don't think I was fully aware of the huge benefits of marketing. And to be fair, I don't think they were as developed as they are now.
Yeah.
So, I now have, it's simple enough to manage. I have an excellent marketing agency called Loaded Hype, and they based in Manchester, and they effectively produce my podcast. I do a blog article, and I do a couple of posts, surveys, etc. on LinkedIn. I'm only on LinkedIn because that's where my clients expect to find me. So you can imagine the recruitment industry. So that's one thing. And the second is, I would probably, I cannot remember where I pitched myself in terms of price and so on at the beginning, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't high enough. I'm pretty sure I undervalued myself in order to give myself the blanket of lots of activity. So it was much later on when I thought, this is madness, Alison. And my business was doing really well, but I barely had time to make these podcasts because I was with clients all day. Now, you will know, if you're in the consultancy business, there is no way you can shortcut the labor element.
Yeah.
So the more business you win, the more time is taken up doing delivery. And so there was a point when I made a very conscious decision to increase my fees, even if the result was less work. And here's the interesting thing. It was actually much better financially for me. And I pitched myself differently, and I made absolutely certain that people got really good value because I knew that they were paying for it. Whereas before they weren't paying for it, but they still thought they should get the full gold plated, So value yourself highly enough, I think.
Yes. But that leads me into that whole where we could probably go for another 45 minutes on how you value yourself, because you said the words, I pitched myself differently. So to pitch yourself differently, you had to maybe believe in yourself differently. So did your self-belief change, or was it I'm going to do it and then the rest of it's going to find its way in the ripples that come afterwards?
I think my belief, my perspective changed. And I'll be really specific about this. So learning and development's been a huge part of my career. And, I went and did a postgrad in it and all the rest of it. And I was really good at it. And at certain points, I have been the director of learning and development for some fairly significant businesses. But I was always very, very careful not to just go down that path, but to stay very attached to the profit and loss, right? Profit. And therefore, all my training interventions, I was very clear what return on investment they were meant to give the business. So I avoided the trap that lots of people do who go down the L&D route. I avoided the trap of effectively being seen as a cost. I was just as much a contributor to the net fee income as people who were running, actual recruitment desks. And I think that was a very important decision, because if you go down the other route, and I've obviously been in a position of employing learning and development managers when I've been up the food chain, there's a tendency for them to go worship at a different altar. And that altar is, look at this model, this exciting new study, which is interesting. I totally get that trap. But how does this make the boat go faster in this business is not always clear to them. So anyway, to loop back to your question, Sarah.
Love it.
I originally, when I set up my own business, found myself being asked to deliver training by people who were bluntly quite ignorant about learning and development. So you'd get requests like, so can you just come and do some business development training? And I'd say, well, what for? What do you want to achieve? What part of business development? Who is your client base and all this? And they're like, oh, just anything really. Just give them a bit of a refresher, a day out. And these were people who thought that there was some magic pixie dust and had very low expectations of learning and development as a change management tool. Yeah. And more, I find myself having to do loads and loads of consultancy pre and post these learning and development interventions to make sure they got results. And so the business owners I was speaking to, I was more and more involved in their whole business strategy, because it's one thing teaching people new skills, but if the systems and infrastructure and tech and incentive schemes are mitigating against implementing those new skills or discouraging it, you're not going to get the change, right? I think we all realize that in a way. And then I thought, well, hang on a minute, I'm here giving you consultancy about your whole business. And that was the decision I chose to make, was to say, well, hang on, I'm a whole business advisor and I look at the whole of an organization, and I've got the credibility to do it because of what I can point to in achievements and recent achievements at that. And that kind of advice doesn't have this commoditized price point that pure L&D does.
Yeah. So, and it's that confidence needs evidence, isn't it? So it's spending that all important reflection time on what you're actually delivering, and then packaging that up for the belief, because you're so right. And unfortunately, I still think there's a little bit of, I work in a lot of L&D, and there's still a lot of that. Let's sprinkle the magic dust. Watch the magic dust that's going to suddenly be the zeitgeist that's going to change it. And it's like understanding your business is the key, and then everything flows from there. So if you met your younger self today, what would you say to her?
Don't undervalue yourself.
I love it. Brilliant. I didn't lead you there on purpose. So the final question I always ask my guests is, What is your 6-word memoir, which of course comes from Ernest Hemingway's shortest story ever told? And I love it from a point of view. Some people use it as a mantra, some people use it as an affirmation, some people use it as the legacy they want to leave, the trace they want to leave, or simply a reminder of who you are and how you're going to show up. Alison, what's your 6-word memoir?
Okay, so I think mine is always keep learning. Change is constant.
Oh, and that brings in the whole discussion that we've had today of, where we've come from, what we do today, how we move forward, how we constantly evolve in our businesses as well. It's not a case of going, here's my business and this is it, boom, I've nailed it. It's the evolving of it that's so important, isn't it?
And I think we can all point to like AI and world change here that, my goodness, we've seen a lot more change than we've seen for some time, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's exciting. Yes, we're living in a world of uncertainty, but the opportunity, the creativity, the excitement, if we can harness that, there's a whole difference out there we can make as well. Alison, thank you so much for being an absolutely fabulous guest. It's been bloody brilliant talking to you.
Been a great pleasure, and thank you for all your interesting questions.
My pleasure indeed. I love it. It absolutely floats my boat. Thank you so much, and I'll see you soon. As we button up another episode of It's Got Pockets, remember that just like that perfect dress with hidden storage, you've got pockets of potential. You can be exactly who you are meant to be with no one getting in your way, not even yourself. Just remember, you're not done yet. That plan B or plan C might be waiting for you. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to work with me, or simply want to connect, come and find me at sarahknightconsultancy.co.uk. On Instagram, I'm Ministry of Midlife, or on LinkedIn, you'll find me as NightES. See you next time.